So thank you for joining us this morning, and then representatives of our two senators, Tina Smith and Amy Klobuchar, and many, many other people who represent important constituencies here. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm going to pass this microphone around because it works, and ask you if you would just tell us your name and the organization that you represent. I'm going to start here with you. You're over here all by yourself. And then if you'll just pass it around.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ann Tracy, and I work on a contract basis with the Blandin Foundation, so I help maintain the Blandin on Broadband blogs. I'm here to take notes and hear your stories.
I'm Nick Leonard with Ottertail County.
I'm Jeff Backer, representative from West Central Minnesota, and I have donut in my mouth.
I'm Rick West, Ottertail County Public Works Director.
Lee Rogness, Ottertail County Commissioner. Welcome to Ottertail County.
I'm Chuck Johnson with the City of Perham.
I'm Dave Bickett from Park Region Telephone, Ottertail Telecom, and Rossay Telephone.
Kevin Byer with Federated Telephone Cooperative out of Chicago, Minnesota, and Farmers Mutual Telephone Company out of Bellingham, Minnesota.
Good morning, I'm Nicole Bernholz with Alexandria Area Economic Development Commission. We're out of Alexandria and we service all of Douglas County.
I'm Joel Dahlheimer from the Alexandria EDA, the West Central Initiative Board.
Good morning, I'm Tim Thompson with Lake Region Electric Cooperative.
Good morning, I'm Dave Shornack with Arvig.
Kay Johnson with Herman Development Corporation.
Good morning, I'm Jill Amundsen, and this completes my first week at West Central Initiative. So glad to be here.
I'm Nick Ripperger with the Herman Development Corporation.
Hello, hi, my name is Paul Anderson, the state representative.
Good morning, Paul Jurdy from County Commissioner.
Hi, Donna Martin, Polk County IT Director.
Hi, I'm Carson Ouellette. I am Senator Tina Smith's Western Minnesota Outreach Director.
Roger Breming, Ottertail County Commissioner.
Janie Steves from Lakes Country Service Cooperative.
Troy Johnson, Grant County Commissioner.
Hi, I'm Jeff Spolton with the United States Department of Agriculture Rural Development Office in Alexandria.
Guy Fisher, Becker County EDA, Parks and Recreation.
Andrew Gagg with USDA Rural Development.
John Okeson, Becker County Commissioner.
Barry Nelson, Becker County Commissioner.
Hi, I'm Dave Arvig from Arvig.
Good morning, I'm Don Soda from the City of Pelican Rapids.
I'm Matt Holtberg with the New York Mills School District.
Randy Anderson, Superintendent, Pelican Rapids.
Wayne Hurley, West Central Initiative staff.
Jason Dale with Cooperative Network Services.
Kellen Doubles with New Ulm Telecom.
Bud Norton, State Representative. This is the area I represent.
James Allen, Leighton Broadcasting.
Thanks, everyone. I'm Bill Coleman. Oop, did I just turn that up? No, good. And happy to be here this morning. I've been working in rural economic development for about long time, and rural telecommunications now for about 20 years. I used to work Department of Trade and Economic Development, and I wrote a paper about telecommunications and economic development back in about 1996. And then, our community profiles had one sentence about telecommunications is name of phone company. And that's all people needed to know. Now economic development and broadband is a key part of site selection for economic development in rural areas. And just recently, rural and urban areas really. We just heard the State Broadband Task Force heard a big report from all the telecom companies about what was installed in the Twin Cities in advance of the Super Bowl. And multi-gigabit wireless networks by the stadium and at the Mall of America and the 494 Strip and a little bit in St. Paul just because they thought they should get some. And so the speeds at which technology are advancing is really incredible, no doubt about that. But we know how important this is for rural Minnesota. And we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to breeze through this technology discussion. It's be interesting for me because I've got a lot of technologists in the room, and they're all very taking notes and taking names and everything. So one of the things that goes with this technology discussion is the answer many times is it depends. And there's a lot of different situations, a lot of different technologies, how it's deployed. Just talking with Dave Bickett from Park Region. It's a lot of things just depend on how things are deployed. So there are no hard and fast rules about how some of these technologies are. So there's room for discussion. In this case, this might work a lot better. In this case, maybe not so well. And so we'll go through some of those. But we have a lot of chance at the end of the meeting, at the end of the presentations, to have a great discussion. We could hopefully, with the talent in this room and the knowledge of your area by the county commissioners and legislators and so on, with the technology people that we have in the room, have a great discussion about some of the things that community leaders need to think about as they're trying to improve broadband in their community. So these are some broadband fun facts. A key thing is that the FCC now has really reaffirmed the idea that 25 down and 3 up is the minimum standard for broadband. That's the definition of broadband. There was some talk that that was going to go down to 10 megabits down and 1 up, and that a cellular connection was going to count as being served. And from my perspective, thankfully, that's not the case, because we know that there's growing demand for broadband. We know that applications and households are using a lot more broadband, and so the idea of going backwards on that standard is really an important thing. So people say, well, I'm selling you a 10 megabit broadband connection. In some ways that's really false advertising, because there is no 10 megabit broadband connections. It is an internet connection, but it's not broadband. We know how fast things are increasing. There's companies in this region that offer gigabit level services, 1,000 megabits. We know that in residential areas in Minneapolis, you can get a 10 gigabit residential connection for less than what some people might be paying for their combination of cellular and satellite and lower speed DSL service. Comcast just sent me a note and said, well, we're just going to raise your speed by 50 meg. And so that's the world in which we live. Seen a lot of numbers on this. I pulled one out. It said average family now uses 250 gigabytes of data a month. So if you're buying it by the 10 or 20 or 30 from your satellite company or cellular company, know that that's a lot less than the average family. Comcast has another way to look at this is a data cap. Comcast data cap now is 1 terabit. So I can't even say how many zeros that is, but that's a lot of zeros. And know that everything is being connected. Your refrigerators, your thermostats, your furnaces, your water heaters, pacemakers, diabetes. You see now that Apple, during the Olympics, they had a lot of ads about health care, that their Apple Watch saved their life. That is just one part. That wrist thing is going to be, and how many people have like Fitbits or something on wearing right now? So, better get with it. Your doctors are going to want you to wear those pretty soon. As your telecom provider wants you to wear them. So I'm sorry about the clarity of this picture, but this is a digital divide index created by a professor from Purdue. It combines socioeconomic, and the slides will be available on the Blandin on Broadband blog. And so, but this essentially shows, combines connectivity and socioeconomic characteristics. So if you're in brown counties, that's not good. That means that you're not connected, you have an aging population, a poorer population, and so when you think about economic competitiveness, you don't want to be brown or bronze on this. And here's the, what the data shows. And this is the state and nationally. The places with the lowest digital divide indexes are growing in number of people and workforce. People who are on the opposite, the brown counties, are losing population and workforce. You can say, well, they're just putting, you know, is that correlation or causation? I don't know. If we go back here and look, there's places that are pretty well connected that have low scores. Places like Bemidji, up here and farther north of you guys, Cook County, certainly the Twin Cities Metro. So part of that is socioeconomics. But the idea of how do you attract and maintain younger people in your communities is really important to this index. And certainly younger people in particular don't want to live places where they can't be connected. When we think about broadband, it's not just the download speed that people are talking about, how you judge broadband. It's that upload speed. A lot of times people talk that the upload speed is the economic development side, it's the production side. The download speed is the consumption side, Netflix and so on. But it's that upload that people are uploading information to the cloud more and more. We all back up our photos, our files to Dropbox or Google Drive or multiple banks. If a bank chain has records, it's all being stored in one place, that people are working on that database at the same time. So that upload is really important. Certainly affordability is critical. If it's $100, $150 for an internet connection, a lot of people aren't going to be able to afford that. The flip side of that, you know, they want it for $20, the telecom providers aren't going to be able to afford that. So you have to find that right balance. Reliability is more and more important. As things are stored in the cloud, you can't reach the cloud, you can't get to your data, you can't work. So my son is a GIS specialist, computer mapping specialist. Their internet connection in Salt Lake City went down for a day. They all had to go home because they couldn't work. And so we see that more and more. We're hearing from people that no broadband connection might be a better alternative than an unreliable one. Because people, when they need it, they expect it to be there. And if it's not, that causes a lot of problems. We know that mobility now is critical. Everyone in this room probably has a device that can send an email or get a text or look things up online. So that's certainly an important part. And then finally, latency. That's the delay at which information is sent. And that's one of the chief issues with satellite technology, is that sending information up 20,000 miles in the sky takes about 800 milliseconds there and back. Well, that's almost like talking on a two-way radio. A lot of things don't work with that kind of delay. And so that latency is really important. The flip side of that is fiber. Instead of 800 milliseconds, it's about 6 or 8 or 10 milliseconds in a fiber network. And so that instantaneous communication is really important. This is a state broadband map in terms of where services are. When I look at this, green is go. That's where there's fiber. That's where there's people can meet the state broadband standard for 2026, which is 100 megabits down and 20 up. The red is where it's less than 25.3. So all those areas in red are grant eligible. Thanks to the state broadband grant program, we've actually filled in quite a bit of territory on these maps to be in the green. And you know, the green areas now can really meet any standard because they have the fiber. So if the state said a gigabit is our standard, they could meet it. And so that's really an important consideration about being ready for the future, having an infrastructure that works for today. This is your region, and you can see a fair amount of all kinds of colors here, the greens and the purples, which is between 25.3 and 100 down and 20 up, and then the red. So still plenty of red on the map. And as I said, green means go and red means stop. 70% of people now won't buy a house unless it has a high quality internet connection. And so if you think about the red areas, that just makes it harder to sell a home. And as you think about trying to attract people to an area, people increasingly are going to pick areas that are in the green areas. I used to get some random calls from people. They had, bought their dream house and thinking that they could get internet. They just assumed that they could get internet. Had planned to telework to their place in the Twin Cities or to their company in the Twin Cities. They buy this house high end of the market in a rural community, and then suddenly that's more of a nightmare for them because they have to piece together their internet connectivity. But people don't call me anymore because now people are really careful. They now make sure that there's quality internet there. These are technology challenges. Know that all technologies are getting better all the time. The fiber, Dave and I were talking that used to be able to get 100 meg over fiber. Well, now you can get 10 gigabit over fiber. Now they send colors up and down those lasers, not just one single flashing white light. Know that cellular is an important thing. We know that cell service is getting better. We hear about the 5G. That's really a marketing term. The technical standards for 5G aren't even established yet. But most of that technology requires fiber to within 1,000 feet of a place to have that kind of connectivity. So when we think about what was going on with the Super Bowl, a lot of that is kind of 5G, 4G plus kind of activity. But that's right by the stadium. When you're thinking about a rural deployment, the 5G is going to be a long time in coming, and it's certainly highly dependent. Those green areas could have 5G because the fiber is everywhere, and so that's it's going to be building on that fiber base. We know that as you drive around any of your region here, that you can lose a phone call at any time. You might not have data coverage, and so a lot of rural is still waiting for 4G or 3G. If you look at the state broadband map, that's shown in blue, nice pretty blue. It's just like the Pacific Ocean, it just is everywhere, but it's not really, as we know in our own experience. Again, that cellular is really dependent on fiber. And then data plans, it's unlimited until you hit the limit, and then they slow you way down. I mentioned the latency on satellite, the same thing in the data plans. We know that fixed wireless is really coming on, and especially if that is connected to fiber. So if that individual tower is connected to a fiber loop, there's real potential to have big connectivity. There's 50 meg symmetrical service now available in a fixed wireless environment, which that would solve most people's problems, certainly for the near term. But trees eat wireless, and that's a big issue. And this area is kind of split. You have a lot of woods, but there's also a lot of prairie. And so the prairie, it can work very well. And one of the things that we found is that if I look at the different wireless providers, those companies that are already fiber providers, fiber to the home providers, telecommunications companies, they've got a network with a lot of bandwidth in it. And so they're able to provide these higher speeds. A lot of those wireless companies are more small entrepreneurial companies that have to buy their bandwidth kind of locally. And so they're asking the telephone company to say, hey, sell me some bandwidth so I can take your customers. That's not a real, the incumbent providers aren't exactly motivated to give them a great deal in the bandwidth. And so that's kind of the price of the connectivity for some of these smaller wireless companies is important. There's now two federal programs that are providing subsidies for rural broadband. One called the CAF2 goes to the bigger companies, Frontier and CenturyLink primarily, Windstream and Consolidated out of Mankato. So you can see these green areas are those eligible for this Connect America Fund. And then this is the ACAM program, which is for the mid-sized carriers, which I learned a little something today. I thought this was primarily for the companies like Arvig and Bevcom and New Ulm and so on. But I learned that the cooperatives were also getting some of these dollars. And so that's the area, and I know that's not a very good map, but that's what the FCC provided me of to where that is. So that's money to help provide better internet service in areas. Almost all, a lot of them funds are being used for kind of a fiber to the node technology. And I think there's some mix in here, and I think especially on the smaller company side, more use of this to build brand new fiber to the home networks. But in many cases, this is fiber to the node and then using DSL services from there. Know that the CAF2 program only requires a 10 megabit down and 1 megabit connection for it to count in their tally that they have to meet. I think CenturyLink got about money to serve about 80% of their unserved homes in Minnesota. And so the CAF2 is 10-1. The ACAM program requires either 25-3 or 10-1 or 4-1, depending on where you are and the cost to build and all kinds of things that I don't have time to read all that books. So but it's that really varies. But there's no requirement to serve everyone. They just can be more opportunistic about where they serve, trying to hit the most people with the fewest amount of dollars. And that certainly makes sense from a business perspective, but it leaves parts of areas unserved or at something less than the 10 down and so on. Within 3,000 feet, 25 meg or more is possible. And there's lots of technologies that can help boost kind of technologies. Talking again to Dave today about, well, you know, that 3,000 feet might be 4,500 feet in terms of where those services are. They are able to do things like bond lines together. So they, instead of giving you one phone line, they take two and hook them together and to boost the speeds that way. Know too that the copper condition is really critical. A lot of times in my old days, climbing under cars and trying to duct tape a new muffler into some bad exhaust pipes. And that's kind of what I think of this as, is you're putting fiber out to the node and then maybe connecting that to 30, 40, or 50-year-old copper lines. So this is a DSL chart that I found that if you're sitting right on that, if you can see at the bottom of your driveway, those electronics are there, you might be able to get up to 80 megabits. But here by the time you get to 1 kilometer, which is about 3,000 feet, you're at just under 30 meg. And by the time you're out at 3 kilometers, or just under 10,000 feet, then you're down under 10 megabits. And so that's a real challenge for this technology. Fiber, when you put a signal on there, can go for 25, 30 miles. But here we're talking about feet, and so that's a challenge. This is a customer, Frontiers gave it, you know, they got this from Frontier, and they talked about 6 or 8 pairs of bonded lines and what speeds and so on. And so there is a lot of wizardry, and I never doubt the ability of engineers to get more capacity out of some of these infrastructures, but a lot of it all depends. I actually did a drive around because people said, well, what is this CAF2 going to do for us? And some of us say, well, 10-1 networks, that's not going to be any good. And then the telecom providers say, hey, we're going to get 40 to 80 meg. Anyone who applied for a state broadband grant that was competing against the incumbents got a letter saying, we're going to provide 40, 80 meg service in your area, so you don't really need to apply and work with that other company. And so these red circles represent 3,000 feet service areas, and the blue circles represent 9,000 feet circles. This is an exchange in the Lindstrom area in Chisago County. Probably one of Frontier's better exchanges in terms of population growth and wealth and incomes and so on. And so you can see it's a pretty comprehensive coverage of that area, almost all the area within that exchange is within the blue circles. Note too that when I show these circles, 3,000 feet, that's as the crow flies. And so we know that telephone lines don't go as the crow flies. They follow county and township roads. They follow lake shores. And so these circles, I've been told by a lot of technologists, are too generous. But that was my goal here, is to kind of give a fair shake to what's being happened. So that looks pretty good, but then if you look here, the red circles only, that kind of shows that, you know, the people within these areas, maybe, you know, they get the 25 meg or maybe the 40 meg at the most, and everyone else is going to have declining levels of service from there based on that. Suddenly that doesn't look so good. And so I know I want to say too that we've sent my maps and so on to CenturyLink and Frontier, and they chose not to comment or correct. I said I'd include whatever they wanted as a response in my report that's still in draft stage, and they declined to do that. This is a CenturyLink exchange in Bram, which is more rural, lower incomes, and there's actually people who do live in these areas here of this exchange that have no service. It gets a little confusing because CenturyLink had some old equipment out in the field. I couldn't tell whether it was running or not, so I maybe double counted on some of these things. But that's the same pattern you're left with in that exchange. And so hardly, yes sir?
The red dots towers?
Those are, generally they're fiber-fed electronics. So a DSL access module is what those would be called. And so these are wired solutions. And then fiber to the home, is that a good choice? And we know that the fiber to the home, depending if you're in town or out in the countryside, $4,000 to $12,000. I talked about the percentages of people who won't buy a house without internet. The fiber connected home increases in value. Live broadband saves people money. And then we know that a lot of these triple play services available from a telecom company or cable company are a lot cheaper than adding dish to a satellite internet connection, to a cellular connection, and a slow DSL connection. So we think it's a pretty good value. And people say, well, $10,000 is a lot of money. But these are, you know, this is a bunch of 10-year-old stuff on Craigslist, an old Lund, 10-year-old F-150. So these are, you know, we're talking about a fiber infrastructure that can last 30 years compared to consumables that a lot of us have in our driveways. This region is interesting because we saw again on that map that there's some people are very well served, and then a lot of areas that have less than great service. We know that without broadband services, counties are less competitive. So when people are looking, businesses, we know that the economic developers in this room know that attracting investment and especially talent to a region, workforce, is the #1 consideration now for economic sustainability. We know that the deploying fiber to the home in the rural areas, a business person can't say, well, I'm just going to start my company and spend $10,000 per house and charge them $200 a month and make money. You know, you still have to operate that network and do all these other things. So we know that the deployment of this network does cost, and it isn't really a sustainable business model just on its face. And so that's why the subsidies are required, just as we've subsidized rural electric and rural telephone in rural areas for many, many years. The border-to-border grant program, as I mentioned, has had a lot of effect, and I know there's people in this room that have applied for and received those funds. We now have a rural broadband coalition that includes the League of Cities and the counties and now the sugar beet farmers. It's a growing list of organizations that have joined this coalition, hired someone to be at the Capitol and be a single voice for rural broadband in Minnesota. So that April 12th is the Broadband Day on the Hill, and I encourage you to go to that website and take a look at the site to see the information there. It's really, we've heard really good things from the legislators that have happy to hear that there's a single voice for rural broadband. In the past, we kind of relied on the League of Cities and the counties and the schools and the healthcare providers to put in a good word for broadband. But in those last 72 hours at the Capitol, there wasn't really a unified voice for rural broadband. And so we think we'll have that now. There's bills in both the House and Senate with bipartisan authors. So it's pretty exciting. They're asking for $50 million for rural broadband. And last year, the State Broadband Task Force recommended $70 million per biennium to get us to our state broadband goal. And so we came up with 50 because the legislature funded 20 last year. So we're asking for our half this year plus what wasn't funded last year. And we saw that there is a surplus predicted, and hopefully that will get bigger, certainly moving in the right direction from where it was. And so putting our hat in, putting our voice in for rural broadband. So that's my presentation, and what's good enough? That's a good question. And so that's really up to local leaders to decide in your community. You look at yourself and say, hey, what we've got isn't too bad and no one's complaining that loud. You know, you can decide to let that go. Or you can do like some of these other counties and step in, try and facilitate those partnerships to bring world-class broadband to your community. So that's my presentation. Let's see where we are in time. 9:40. Good. So yes, sir.
You mentioned the broadband needs of an average family. I'm curious, how many kids are an average family?
Well, these days about 2, right? 2 kids per family. And it's really, the average family is going to have a lot of, some families might have a bunch of techies who are doing all kinds of activities online. So it was interesting, I was working with the North Star Electric Board of Directors, talking to them about broadband. They're up in Cooch, Lake of the Woods County, and I put that 250 gig thing on the screen, and the guy said, oh, that can't be, I've got 30 gig and that works just fine for him. And at that exact moment, the finance director's phone rang, and it was a message from her cable company that said she had just exceeded her 350 gig data cap, and it was about the 15th of the month. But she says, I just know there are 7 kids sitting on my couch because this summer vacation had just started. And so they had broadband, and so it was they were wearing out the network there in that house. Ann spends more when she travels more on mobile data than she does on else. So I know when she gets her family of girls.
Every 3 hours, I'm getting a new. You've just been charged more. You've just been charged more. Keeps them quiet.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Did Frontier have to give back some of the CAF money because it didn't meet the goals of that?
I've not heard that. Now we're kind of in the point where they have to, by the second year of this program, they have 6-year construction, have to hit 40% of their goal. And I haven't heard that they haven't done that. And so that deployment that they show there, that's kind of their model deployment. They're trying to get their loop lengths down to less than 9,000 feet to meet the goals of that 10 down, 1 up standard. We have seen that in Martin County, down in southwest Minnesota, the county partnered with Frontier, so all they're gonna have is red circles. They won't have the blue circles because they're gonna put in more nodes using state funds to help subsidize that. And then CenturyLink got a state grant in Chisago County in a township and a half to do fiber to the home using the CAF 2 money, but to build fiber to the home. And they got state money and township money to do that. Sir?
Me?
Yes.
Can you go back to the hookup charge? I just want to see that. Can you go back?
Yeah. This one?
Yeah, 4 to 12. Okay.
And so obviously, if you're in an area that has available poles, if you're the electric utility, for example, you own the poles, and you want to do fiber to the home using aerial technology in a town, that's going to be a lot lower than for example, Rock or Cook County that have low densities and they actually have rocks. Yes, sir.
Well, what got me thinking was it's 4 to 12 to hook up. And the home increase is 3 to 7, but if you're gonna hook up, why, what, cause, yeah, it's nice down the road maybe if the house increases in value, but you hook it up and then you go sell it, you just gotta find another house with it or hook up again, so I don't know what difference it does in the home increases unless you're, you know, I mean,
Well, certain number of people sell their homes every year.
well, I get that, or 2 years.
And so it just is a matter of, it's an investment, just like you're remodeling the kitchen, right? You can't get much kitchen remodeled for $10,000. What's gonna add, if people won't buy a lot of people won't buy a house with a lousy kitchen. A lot of people won't buy a house without a good internet connection.
Technology upgrade or remodel.
Exactly right.
I mean, to me, it just, if you're gonna do it, make the money back, $1,500 a year, if it's only 4 or 3 years, you got it back. Might be 5 or 6, but it's just,
But you're not spending that money. I mean, they're not charging you that money. That's what it costs the company, isn't it?
correct. Oh, I don't.
Yeah, so that's the cost to build it. And so we've seen different models where, for example, a county might sell a bond and lend that money to a provider over a long period. One of the challenges with rural broadband investment, especially for the bigger companies, is that there's shareholders say, when you invest $1, we want that money back quickly and we want a return on that investment quickly. I hear 24 to 36 months is kind of that hurdle. On a lot of these rural projects, I hear from my co-op friends is that they're looking at more of a 10-year payback, and even with the 50% state grant. And so it's a patient kind of thing. Those in economic development know that economic development finances, you want to match the term of the loan to the term of the asset. And so the idea that you finance something over a long period and it gives you a long string of benefits is the way to go. It's interesting, everyone has a different balance sheet. And so a community's balance sheet is very different than that of the provider. The communities want good schools and good health care and home workers and businesses. And so the providers, that's well and good, and they want a healthy community, but the direct push to their bottom line is more on what's going to happen today. And so that's kind of where the mismatch of interests, the private interest versus the public, and it's worth it for the public to say, what are we going to do to make sure that we can be economically competitive? Just like the city or county might build an industrial park, spend $1 million or more on that, and then wait for somebody to come and build in there. And that might be next year, it could be 2 years, 3 years. You build in 2008, it could be 10 years, right? Because of the economics. And so, no one's coming without that industrial park. And so you have to be ready with that. And that's the same kind of necessary infrastructure.
I guess 2 years ago, when we first put the small satellite on the house, you had to pay $1,100 or $15 to get it. And now they beg you to take them and they give you whatever. So down the road, this might be just another something that we're, from the phone to the cell phone to the satellite. It'll be something that'll be there, but it always starts someplace.
Yeah, and there's talk, a lot of broadband press releases. AT&T's been, somebody asked me about something called Air Gig, that they can put little antennas on top of power poles and gigabit level service, their video shows. That only goes a few hundred feet from the deal, and when are they going to bring that to rural? It may go down the freeway for self-driving cars, but whether it's going to be on some township road in Becker County or not, when is that going to happen? And so or now we see Elon Musk has talked about launching 1,000 satellites that are going to only be a few thousand feet up in the air, 5,000 feet, and so that latency issue would be diminished, but by 2026. So it's kind of like when the railroad bypassed towns in this part of the state in certain years. You can't say, oh, in 8 years we're going to come and do something for your town. Your town won't be there. you know, because the railroad was the essential infrastructure. Or the difference between the towns on the interstate and those towns not. You can see clearly the impact of that. And so the same thing is happening with the technology, but as we know, everything happens faster now than it did then. I think we're gonna go, one more and then we'll go to Nick. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just a question about regionalism and cooperative, collaborative efforts. I'm on the city council of Fergus Falls. I'd like to be able to increase our ability to have reception on the interstate southeast of Fergus. There's areas, places that are almost dead there as we approach Fergus Falls. What's the best way, in your opinion, to really put energy into collaboration efforts for this? Or the capital, you can call legislators, but you know, we're going more to collaborative regionalism that gets things done. Would you recommend to me how that might best happen if that's a particular issue of trying to increase that service close to Fergus? When I go to Alec, I don't have any problem with that, you know, and it just sort of bugs me that we can't get a reception in that area when you're coming close to it.
Yeah, and so one of the things that communities can do, and I think the regional approach is good, but if you're looking at kind of a small area, then of course local action is required. So, you know, where are there public lands there, maybe for a tower, trying to find out from the existing telecom providers where fiber is, and do some kind of a public-private partnership maybe, find out if the sheriff has issues with data services in that area, and so maybe there's some Homeland Security money that could come help build a tower and facilitate it that way. But to pave the way, eliminate barriers to private investment on something like that would be good. Sure.
What was the story on Traverse County? They got it. What was it? Somebody, was that maybe at one of the board meetings? How did they get that? Because it's flat out there, but the whole county's got high speed or is it broadband? I mean,
Yeah.
like they were in the red or green out there.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure that the map is reflective of what was built last summer.
How did they get that?
Well, so they, yeah, and so they had I actually was out and did a couple presentations in Traverse County, but they kind of took the bull by the horns, and there was an interested provider there. And so it's my understanding, and Donna, you probably know this better than I do, but that they kind of cut a deal that if the county would lend that company money and help facilitate some of the tower discussions. The beautiful thing about the ag environment is that you've got water towers and you got grain elevators and all kinds of what they call vertical real estate, that they said they helped facilitate that and lent them some money, and when the companies reached a certain number of subscribers that they would begin to pay back the county the funds. So the county put in the risk money, because a lot of these smaller wireless companies may not be bankable, you know, for that kind of investment, because how are you going to take back the tower, right? You know, if you're a bank, you don't want a tower out in the middle of a field. So, so the county assumed that risk, and then they've had really good reception from that, I think. And you know, for people who are sitting at 1 or 2 megabits, or really expensive satellite service, or relying on cellular, you know, to be able to get even a 10 meg down and 1 megabit up connection is a huge improvement. You know, if it doesn't have that latency, it's maybe, you know, under $50 or, you know, more affordable. So that, you know, certainly if you've got nothing, you know, getting up to a 10 meg connection is a huge improvement. I kind of say, you know, it's from Oliver Twist, you know, more gruel, please. You know, it's not great, it's not really broadband anymore, but it's a better internet connection that a lot of people have.
Is that supposedly a broadband network that they put in place or not?
Well, they didn't. There was no state funding required, so I don't know what level of service they actually can provide there. We hear I'm at a lot of these meetings where wireless providers are, and they say wireless is great, we can do all these things, but if you go to their website, it's a 10 down, 1 up connection they're selling. And part of that is due to the expensive nature of the backhaul, what they call backhaul, their wholesale internet connection for some of these smaller companies is quite expensive.
Bill, I think that's an important part that a lot of people in this room maybe don't know, is that wireless isn't wireless. That isn't where the bandwidth comes from. The bandwidth is wireless, goes to a tower, goes to the ground, that gets the fiber. That's where the bandwidth is.
Yes, yeah.
All they're doing is fiber thrown out on a tower and thrown it out, but they still gotta go down to the ground to a fiber.
They say something like 90% of the distance covered on a wireless connection is on wired connection. Yes, sir.
Speaking as a former employee of a company that specialized in fixed point broadband, so exactly what we're talking about, that's just not an acceptable long-term solution for Minnesota. It's not acceptable that your neighbor's trees get cut off your internet connection. It's not acceptable that someone can build a barn to fit their new tractor and now you don't have internet. I mean, fixed point internet is not an acceptable long-term solution. It's like party lines and telephones. If we need a universal access fee to get fiber into every home, that's what we need to do. But, I mean, we need to just end the discussion on fixed point wireless as a long-term solution.
Although if you ask the people in Traverse County now, they probably say, hey, you know, certainly, and we see in, there's a new fiber cooperative in Renville and Sibley County called RS Fiber. And they've built fiber to the home in each of their towns now. I think it's 10 or 12 towns. And they put the wireless up on top of their water towers and on some grain elevators. And they're offering fixed wireless now out in the countryside as an interim solution towards an all-fiber future. And so I think that is an interim step. There's a lot of merit to that fixed wireless, especially in the right environment. I'm working up in northeast Minnesota in St. Louis County. You know, pine trees eat wireless. And so in the spectrum, wireless gets very complicated because, you know, and the government, FCC, really controls who gets that spectrum. There's some discussion now about white spaces. That's a big Microsoft press release on broadband. And that's taking the spectrum from TV channels that isn't used. You know, out in the countryside, you might, you know, 4, 5, 9, and 11 from the Twin Cities, whatever. That leaves a lot of you know, 6, 7, 8 channels out there that could be used for broadband. And that's actually very great spectrum, but it can go a long way. It's kind of in the middle. It can go a long way and has some capacity, but doesn't meet the state, wouldn't meet the state broadband requirements. So that's my understanding on that. We're Nick, you're up, right? You're up. Do we have a break? Oh, we do have a break that I've all used up already. So
Take a 10-minute break?
Yep.
Okay, then we'll reconvene.
good. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, that 5
Oh, good.